We asked the body to reject this bill tonight. The county executive, this administration, this council have made fighting all forms of discrimination a top priority. We're disappointed to see Councilman Volke attempt to politicize the progress we are making and still have to make by bringing forward 8121. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hill and Ms. Smith to discuss in more detail their concerns with this bill.
Good afternoon. Pete Hill, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Director for Arundel County. I would like to say that I've not called this bill racist. I've not referred to it as white supremacist, but I will call it unnecessary. So good evening, Madam Chair and council members. I'm here this evening to discuss the harm I believe that proposed Bill 8121 will cause to the newly established Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office. As the director of the EDI office, I'm trained to use a historical lens to understand how policymakers in the last century used the color of law to craft legislation at all levels of government that benefited some residents while harming others. It is vitally important that I be permitted to use historical data to demonstrate to current policymakers the dangers of writing laws that are neutral on their face but are discriminatory when placed in practice. In my role as the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Director for Anne Arundel County, my primary charge is to conduct a risk management assessment using the equity lens, which is a form of critical thinking. The equity lens compels policymakers to ask this question: if the proposed bill becomes law, who will benefit from it and who will be burdened by it? When we apply the who will it benefit and who will it burden question to proposed Bill 8121, this is what I discovered. I discovered that if I taught a class on the historical use of laws such as redlining, which was a practice of local, state, and federal government policymakers that mandated segregation of people of color from the white community. If I taught that inconvenient truth in one of my classes, proposed Bill 8121 can be interpreted to say that anyone attending my class could accuse me of discriminating against them because they feel I'm suggesting they are responsible for the actions committed by other members of the same race they belong to. Consider this example. If I taught a class on sexual harassment and presented statistical evidence that proves that male supervisors are more likely to commit acts of sexual harassment than are their female counterparts, do you realize that proposed Bill 8121 can be interpreted to say that the male supervisors attending my class could accuse me of discriminating against them simply because I stated a fact about male supervisors? In other words, because sex is a protected class in Bill 8121, the male supervisors attending my class could file a discrimination complaint because they believe I am blaming them for the actions of the male supervisors whom I cited in that study. Lastly, I would note that this bill as currently written has the potential to keep professionals like me from training the workforce and the community on subjects such as racism and sexism. This is true because of the fear of what the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission calls the chilling effect. What does that mean? It means in this case A bill is written in such a vague fashion that by its very design, it deters professional trainers from doing their jobs because of the fear of being falsely accused of discrimination. Now, in fairness, this bill does benefit some people. It benefits those who do not believe that critical thinking using historical examples is a relevant and worthwhile endeavor. This bill benefits the people who do not want to acknowledge that past behavior has current consequences. This bill benefits the people who do not believe we can learn valuable lessons from studying how race has played a pivotal role in how institutions have historically implemented policies in minority communities. This bill is written in such a manner that its primary goal is crystal clear. That goal is to shut down intellectual debate by withholding funding from the programs and trainers who are charged with raising awareness among policymakers. Madam Chair, the proposed bill, while cloaked in the language used in federal anti-discrimination laws, is in actuality an illy concealed attempt at stifling my ability to teach policymakers how to use critical thinking skills to determine the benefits and the burdens of proposed policy. I urge the Council to reject this bill because the risk outweighs any potential benefit. And I thank the Council for listening.
Hit it.
I don't want to have to gavel anybody, but I'm sorry, we're not supposed to have applause. It's part of our rules. You can shake your hands in a silent way, but please don't clap. Thank you.
Good evening, Madam Chair. Oh, I'm
No,
sorry.
go ahead, Miss. I was just calling on you.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the Council. I am Asha Smith, the Equal Opportunity and Human Relations Officer for Anne Arundel County. I appreciate the opportunity to respond to Mr. Volke's proposed bill. The proposed bill seeks to prohibit county funding of discrimination, which seems a benign enough proposition. However, to understand the effect of the bill, it is critical to understand how the bill defines discrimination. In its initial rendering, the author sought to define discrimination as a series of beliefs rather than acts. This is outside of the framework in which anti-discrimination laws have developed and been interpreted for the last 50 years or so. Under our foundational anti-discrimination laws, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the Equal Pay Act, we focus on actions that create adverse outcomes, not beliefs. Mr. Volke has since amended the bill. He no longer seeks to define discrimination as a series of beliefs. The language now defines discrimination as acts or conduct that express certain beliefs, specifically, acts or conduct that express the inherent superiority or inferiority of a particular group, acts or conduct that express that individuals should be adversely treated because they are in a certain group, acts or conduct that express that some individuals in a group are responsible for the acts of other individuals just because they're in the same group. I'm challenged to find a meaningful distinction between restrictions on expression and restrictions on belief. The amendments do not improve the bill. They make it even more vague and difficult to administer. First, what is an act or conduct that expresses something? Are we referring to speech, what someone says? If the bill proposes to restrict speech, we must consider the First Amendment. Generally, the Supreme Court has held that restrictions on speech because of content violate the First Amendment. They tend to be unconstitutional. That said, there are times when speech can be restricted. To determine whether a restriction is appropriate, we must carefully consider who is speaking, where the speech is happening, and what the speaker is saying. Context is critical. Here's another thing we know about discrimination in speech. Anti-discrimination laws don't protect stray remarks or utterances, which are expressions of sentiments, right? If a person makes an offensive remark one time, even if it's a hateful slur, it's unlikely that a court will impose liability for discrimination under federal and state laws. So we return to the question, what is an act or conduct that expresses something? If it's not speech, what is it? How do we know when conduct expresses a sentiment, and who decides? As written in this bill, we simply do not know. Here's what we do know, though. The author is not referencing discrimination as we commonly understand it. He seeks to prohibit county funding of what is newly defined as discrimination in the bill. This new definition does not exist in the current anti-discrimination landscape, so it is difficult to anticipate its effects. Our familiar time-tested anti-discrimination laws, such as Title VI and VII of the Civil Rights Act, are concerned with adverse outcomes for real people. A malfeasor has to do something because of someone's protected characteristics. The act has to result in adverse outcomes in order for there to be liability under the law. An adverse outcome might be a loss of pay, loss of a promotion, the inability to access a service or a resource, or an environment so hostile that it's nearly impossible for a reasonable person to report to work there. There's another type of discrimination under existing laws, where laws or policies unintentionally have an adverse impact on an entire group of people with the same protected characteristics. It also results in adverse outcomes. For example, there's an entire line of cases where women were denied employment because employers required applicants to undergo strength tests that were deemed to be irrelevant to the job, and the tests disqualified these women. The salient point is that there was an act, use of the test, and an adverse outcome. Women were denied employment. By contrast, Mr. Volke's bill defines discrimination as expression, presumably one's words or actions or some combination. The question is, why? We know that there's value in teaching even abhorrent beliefs. By way of illustration, we can all agree that we should know who the Nazis are and what they did and the consequences of the Holocaust. If taught correctly, learning about the Holocaust won't make someone a Nazi. In fact, we hope that learning about it prevents a Holocaust from ever happening again. So we must ask, why is a bill like this necessary? Why do we need legislation that defines discrimination in this new way at this time in history? What does this bill do that our existing anti-discrimination laws do not? Does this new definition conflict with our existing laws? I posit that the bill is not necessary or even useful. When we look at the legislative history of foundational legislation like the Civil Rights Act, we are told in detail about the documented adverse outcomes that it intended to address. The intention of this bill is presented in the whereas clauses before the definitions. It doesn't purport to address adverse outcomes. Rather, the author tells us that it seeks to respect dignity, acknowledge the right to express differing opinions, and to foster and defend intellectual honesty, freedom of speech, and freedom of association. But the Constitution of the United States meets these ends. Nothing in this bill does more than the Constitution to advance these objectives. In fact, this bill polices speech. The author's reference to critical race theory suggests that it seeks to police a very particular type of speech, which he finds to be divisive. Notwithstanding the fact that critical race theory is not an end unto itself, but an an analytical tool used by scholars, Americans have a long history of tackling divisive issues head-on without banning them from public discourse. Finally, the bill does nothing to prevent actual discrimination, that is, adverse outcomes that are visited upon a person or group because of their protected characteristics. It actually clashes with existing discrimination laws. For example, Title VII, a federal law, permits employers to establish affirmative action plans to correct the effects of prior discriminatory hiring practices. To do this, an analysis has to be undertaken. Mr. Volke's bill might prevent our leaders from learning the methods, undertaking the analysis, and effectuating an outcome inconsistent with federal law. For the foregoing reasons, the administration opposes the bill in its original form, as amended, and in its entirety. Thank you.